Betrayal tastes like cold ash, especially when it is served by the person you built your entire life around. Evelyn walked out of her own mansion with nothing but a single suitcase and the mocking laughter of her husband echoing in the freezing rain. He had taken everything, her company, her money, and her dignity, replacing her with a younger woman before throwing her into the street. He thought he had buried her forever. He thought she was just another weak, discarded victim. But Richard forgot one crucial detail. Evelyn was the hidden architect of his empire. Now she is coming back. Rain lashed against the towering iron gates of the Sterling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the quiet, devastating hurricane inside the mansion's mahogany-paneled study. Evelyn Hayes stood frozen, the heavy droplets of rain from her coat seeping into the Persian rug. Across the sprawling oak desk sat Richard Sterling, the man she'd been married to for 7 years. He wasn't looking at her with the warmth of a husband, nor the respect of a business partner. He was looking at her like a spreadsheet that had finally been balanced and discarded. Beside him stood Jonathan Davis, their lead corporate attorney, and a man Evelyn had considered a close personal friend. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "It's over, Evelyn," Richard said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. He slid a thick manila folder across the desk. "These are the severance papers." Along with the divorce decree, Evelyn stared at the folder, her mind racing to process the absurdity of the situation. "Divorce? Richard, what are you talking about?" "I just got back from the London summit. We just secured the expansion for Sterling Dynamics." There is no we anymore," Richard interrupted, leaning back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Sterling Dynamics is going in a new direction. A direction that unfortunately does not include you. Furthermore, Jonathan and I have been reviewing the financials from the European branch. It seems there are several glaring irregularities. Millions of dollars diverted into offshore accounts in the Caymans. Accounts tied directly to your maiden name." The breath left Evelyn's lungs. "That's a lie. You know that's a lie. I built the European infrastructure from the ground up. Every dollar was accounted for, Richard. You oversaw the transfers yourself." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Richard said, feigning a look of mild disappointment. "The paper trail is quite clear. Jonathan has verified it. If this were to go to the authorities, Evelyn, you would be looking at federal prison for embezzlement and corporate fraud." Evelyn turned to the attorney. "Jonathan, you know my signatures. You know my accounts. Tell him." Jonathan finally looked up, his expression painfully neutral. "The evidence is compelling, Evelyn. Richard is offering you a graceful exit. Sign the non-disclosure agreements. Relinquish your 20% stake in the company, and walk away quietly. If you do, the internal audit goes away. If you fight this, we will be forced to hand the files over to the SEC by morning." The sickening realization washed over her. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a meticulously planned execution. Richard hadn't just cheated her out of a marriage. He had orchestrated a hostile takeover of her life. He had spent months forging documents, manipulating the ledgers, and buying off the people she trusted most. "Why?" Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of the betrayal. "I built this company with you, Richard. I worked 90-hour weeks while you were busy playing golf with the board. I gave you my 20s. I gave you my life." "You were a stepping stone, Evelyn," Richard said coldly, standing up to pour himself a glass of scotch. "You were useful for the grind. But Sterling Dynamics is a billion-dollar entity now. It needs a face, a society presence, not a workaholic who smells like stale coffee and airplane cabins." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the study opened. The woman walked in, the soft click of her heels sounding like gunshots in the quiet room. It was Chloe Adams, Richard's new 24-year-old executive assistant. Chloe was wearing Evelyn's custom silk robe, holding a glass of champagne and smiling a smile that made Evelyn's stomach turn. "Is everything all right in here, Ricky?" Chloe asked, gliding over to Richard and resting a perfectly manicured hand on his chest. "The cutteress for tomorrow's party. Need the finalized menu." "Almost done, darling," Richard murmured, kissing Chloe's temple before turning his icy gaze back to Evelyn. "Sign the papers, Evelyn. Your bags have already been packed by the staff and placed by the front door. You have 5 minutes to leave my property before I call security." Evelyn looked at the pen resting on the desk. She looked at the forged documents that could ruin her life. She looked at the man she had loved, realizing that she had never truly known him at all. He was a parasite who had fed on her brilliance, and now that he was full, he was discarding the host. With a shaky hand, Evelyn picked up the pen. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She methodically signed her name on the dotted lines, signing away her company, her fortune, and her marriage. When she finished, she dropped the pen. It clattered against the wood. "You think you've won, Richard," Evelyn said softly, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You think you took my power, but you only took my money. You have no idea how this machine actually runs." Richard laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Goodbye, Evelyn. Don't slip on the driveway." Evelyn turned and walked out of the study. She found her single suitcase waiting by the grand entryway. She opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing Connecticut rain. She had no car, no credit cards, and barely $50 in her purse. As the heavy iron gates clicked shut behind her, sealing her out of the life she had built, Evelyn Hayes looked up at the darkened sky. Her tears finally came, mixing with the rain, but they weren't tears of defeat. They were the baptism of a new woman. 5 years is a lifetime when you are at the bottom. For the first year, Evelyn lived in a cramped, mold-infested apartment in the south side of Chicago. She had changed her last name to Cross, eager to sever any ties to the woman who had been foolish enough to trust Richard Sterling. She worked as an anonymous freelance financial analyst by day and a waitress by night, saving every penny, sleeping 4 hours a night, and watching from afar as Richard paraded Chloe around in the tabloids. Richard had married Chloe a mere 6 months after the divorce. The media dubbed them New York's new power couple. Sterling Dynamics went public, and Richard was hailed as a visionary genius. Every magazine cover, every stock surge, and every smug interview Richard gave was a fresh log thrown onto the raging fire inside Evelyn's chest. She knew the truth. Richard was a brilliant salesman, but a terrible operational manager. Without Evelyn silently steering the ship, mitigating risks and structuring the debt, Sterling Dynamics was a hollow shell built on aggressive expansion and over-leveraged assets. It was building a house of cards. All Evelyn needed was the right gust of wind to blow it down. That wind came in the form of Harrison Brooks. Harrison was a notoriously reclusive venture capitalist in Chicago. He was 62, ruthless, and highly cynical. Evelyn had spent 3 months researching his portfolio, finding the bleeding wounds in his investments that his own team had missed. She managed to corner him at a charity gala she had snuck into through the kitchen. She had handed him a 10-page dossier. "Mr. Brooks, your firm is bleeding 18% quarterly from your tech sector acquisitions because your analysts are miscalculating the depreciation of proprietary server hardware. I know how to fix it, and I know how to turn that loss into a 30% gain by Q4. Harrison had looked at the waitress in the cheap thrift store dress, then looked at the impeccably researched dossier. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the person who is going to make you a lot of money," Evelyn had replied. "If you back my play." Harrison took a chance on her. Within 2 years, Evelyn Cross had become his shadow partner. She operated entirely behind the scenes, utilizing her unparalleled understanding of global markets, corporate loopholes, and aggressive debt restructuring. She made Harrison Brooks hundreds of millions of dollars, and in return, he gave her the capital and the anonymity she needed to build her own weapon. She founded Apex Holdings. It was a private equity firm that existed entirely in the shadows. There were no pictures of the CEO on the website. No press releases, just a relentless, aggressive entity that began quietly acquiring distressed assets across the eastern seaboard. By year 4, Evelyn had amassed a personal fortune that dwarfed what she had lost. But the money wasn't the goal. The money was just the ammunition. She turned her sights back to New York. Back to Sterling Dynamics. Sitting in her corner office on the 50th floor of a Chicago skyscraper, Evelyn stared at the glowing monitors displaying Sterling Dynamics stock. Richard had grown arrogant. Believing he was invincible, he had started aggressively acquiring smaller tech startups, funding the purchases with massive amounts of high-interest corporate debt. "He's overextended," Harrison noted, walking into her office and handing her a cup of black coffee. He leaned against her glass desk, looking at the charts. "Sterling is leveraging his core assets to fund these ridiculous vanity projects. His debt-to-equity ratio is catastrophic." "Because he only understands the headline, Harrison," Evelyn said, a cold smile touching her lips. "Richard loves the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He hates the math. He has placed Sterling Dynamics' primary loans with 3 major commercial banks, and those loans have restrictive covenants," Harrison finished, catching her drift. "If his stock drops below a certain threshold, or if he misses a single quarterly projection, the banks can call the loans in full," Evelyn said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "And I want those loans." Over the next 12 months, Apex Holdings moved like a ghost through the financial sector. Using dummy corporations and proxy buyers, Evelyn began quietly buying up Sterling Dynamics' corporate debt from the banks. It cost her a fortune, but she was patient. She also began heavily shorting Sterling's stock, betting millions against her former husband's success. Meanwhile, in New York, Richard was oblivious. He was busy throwing a lavish $1 million anniversary party for Chloe at the Plaza Hotel. He was standing on a stage raising a glass of vintage champagne surrounded by the city's elite. "To my beautiful wife, Chloe," Richard announced into the microphone, flashing his signature charismatic smile. "And to another record-breaking year for Sterling Dynamics. We are untouchable." The crowd cheered, oblivious to the fact that the very foundation of Richard's empire no longer belonged to the banks. It belonged to the woman he had thrown into the rain 5 years ago. Back in Chicago, Evelyn stood up from her desk and smoothed out her tailored designer suit. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Sarah," Evelyn said to her executive assistant, "initiate Phase 2. Dump our shell company's shares of Sterling Dynamics onto the open market. All of them. Create a panic. Let the stock plummet." "Yes, miss." "Cross." "Initiating now," Sarah replied. Evelyn walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the glittering city lights. "Also, have the jet fueled and ready on the tarmac. Call the pilot. We're heading to New York." The board was set. The trap was sprung. The architect was coming home, and she was bringing hell with her. Tuesday morning in Manhattan began with the crisp, unforgiving light of a clear autumn day. Inside the penthouse suite of the Plaza Hotel, Richard Sterling woke up with a pounding headache, the lingering consequence of 3 bottles of vintage Dom Perignon. He rolled over, pulling the soaked sheets away from Chloe, who was still asleep, a heavy diamond necklace left carelessly on the nightstand. Richard felt invincible. Last night had been a triumph. The press was eating out of the palm of his hand, and Sterling Dynamics was slated to announce the acquisition of yet another Silicon Valley tech firm by the end of the week. He showered, dressed in a custom, charcoal gray Brioni suit, and had his driver take him to the Sterling Dynamics headquarters in Midtown. He walked through the glass-paneled lobby like a conquering emperor, nodding to the security guards and ignoring the interns. He stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it to the 60th floor. At exactly 9:30 a.m., the opening bell rang on the New York Stock Exchange. At 9:31 a.m., Apex Holdings unleashed a flood. Richard had barely taken a sip of his Ethiopian pour-over coffee when his office doors burst open. David Henderson, the chief financial officer of Sterling Dynamics, sprinted into the room. David was a 50-year-old veteran of Wall Street, a man who had survived the 2008 crash and the dot-com bubble. He was not prone to panic, but right now David's face was the color of wet chalk, and his hands were physically trembling. "David, what the hell is wrong with you?" Richard snapped, annoyed by the intrusion. "Did someone die? Look at your terminal," David gasped, practically collapsing into one of the leather guest chairs. "Richard, look at the Bloomberg terminal." "Now," Richard frowned, turning his chair and tapping his keyboard to wake the screen. He pulled up the ticker for Sterling Dynamics, STLD. The line on the graph wasn't dipping. It was falling off a cliff. Yesterday, the stock had closed at a record high of $142 a share. As Richard stared at the screen, the number was ticking down with terrifying speed. $118, $104, $92, $87. "What is this?" Richard demanded, the coffee suddenly turning acidic in his stomach. "Is it a glitch? A software error?" "It's not a glitch," David said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Someone is dumping shares. Massive, institutional-level blocks of shares. Millions of them. They're hitting the market all at once, triggering the algorithmic trading bots. The bots see the massive sell-off, assume insider panic, and they're automatically liquidating our stock to cut losses. It's a cascading failure. The exchange is going to hit the circuit breaker and halt trading if we drop another 5 points." "Who?" Richard yelled, slamming his fist onto the mahogany desk. "Who has that kind of volume? We know all our major institutional investors. It's a web of shell corporations," David explained frantically, shuffling a stack of printouts. "Registered in Delaware, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. They've been quietly accumulating small sub-reporting threshold percentages of our stock for 2 years. They pooled them today and executed a synchronized dump. Richard, they are purposefully crashing our valuation." Richard's mind raced. Fine, let them dump. It's a short-term liquidity attack. We have the cash reserves to weather a dip. We'll issue a press release at noon about the new Silicon Valley acquisition to reassure the shareholders. The stock will bounce back by Friday. David looked at Richard with an expression of profound pity and absolute terror. "Richard, the debt covenants us." The words hit Richard like a physical blow to the chest. To fund his aggressive expansion over the last 3 years, Richard had taken out massive corporate loans from a syndicate of 3 major commercial banks. To get favorable interest rates, he had agreed to strict debt covenanters. One of those covenanters stipulated that if Sterling Dynamics' market capitalization dropped below a specific threshold for even a single trading hour, the banks had the legal right to declare the company in default and call the entire multi-billion-dollar loan due immediately. And the stock had just plummeted past that threshold. "Get Michael Davies of Manhattan Mutual on the phone," Richard ordered, his voice suddenly hollow. Now, it took 10 agonizing minutes to get the senior banker on the line. When Michael Davies finally answered, his tone was completely devoid of the usual fawning respect he gave Richard. "Michael," Richard said, trying to project a confidence he did not feel, "I'm sure you're watching the board. It's a coordinated short-selling attack. A market manipulation tactic. I need you to hold the line. Do not trigger the covenant clauses. We will have this stabilized by tomorrow." "Richard," Michael said, his voice cold and flat. "I can't trigger the covenant." Relief washed over Richard. Thank God. I knew I could count on you, Michael. I can't trigger the covenant, Michael interrupted, because my bank no longer owns your debt. The office went dead silent. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved on, oblivious to the fact that Richard Sterling's empire had just stopped breathing. "Excuse me," Richard whispered. 6 weeks ago, a private equity firm approached the syndicate, Michael explained smoothly. They offered to buy the entirety of Sterling Dynamics' corporate debt at a 10% premium. Given your heavy leverage and the aggressive risk profile of your recent acquisitions, our risk management committee decided it was highly prudent to offload your paper. We sold it all, Richard. Every single loan. Who? Richard asked, his voice cracking. Who bought it? A Chicago-based firm, Michael replied. Apex Holdings. Richard ended the call. He stared at the blank wall, the gears in his head grinding to a halt. A company he had never heard of had orchestrated a massive short sell to crush his stock, deliberately triggering a default clause on billions of dollars in debt that they had secretly purchased. It wasn't just a financial maneuver. It was an assassination. Jonathan Davis, the lead corporate attorney, burst into the office, his usually perfectly combed hair in disarray. Richard, the SEC is calling. The board is melting down, and we just received a courier package from Apex Holdings. Jonathan dropped a thick legal binder onto the desk. They're officially calling the debt. $2.4 billion, due within 48 hours, or they seize our collateral. And Richard, the collateral is the intellectual property patents for our core software. If they take that, the company is effectively dead. Find out who runs Apex, Richard screamed, throwing his coffee cup against the wall where it shattered, leaving a brown stain trailing down the designer wallpaper. Hire private investigators, bribe financial regulators, do whatever it takes. Find the CEO and get them on the phone. They want to play hardball. We'll negotiate. Set up an emergency board meeting for 3 o'clock. At 2:45 p.m., the atmosphere in the Sterling Dynamics boardroom was toxic. 12 board members, an array of wealthy, aging venture capitalists and industry titans, sat around the 30-foot mahogany table. The air was thick with anger, panic, and the scent of expensive sweat. They had all watched their personal net worths plummet by millions of dollars in a matter of hours. Richard stood at the head of the table, his tie loosened, a projector displaying a series of hastily assembled, wildly optimistic financial projections behind him. He was using every ounce of his legendary charm to calm the wolves. "Gentlemen, please," Richard said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "This is a temporary setback. Apex Holdings is a rogue outfit utilizing predatory tactics. We have our legal team, led by Jonathan Davis, exploring every avenue for an injunction against their margin call. We are not going to let some faceless Chicago equity firm steal this company from us." "Faceless?" snapped Arthur Pendleton, a 70-year-old billionaire who held a 10% stake in the company. "They aren't faceless, Richard. They're holding a gun to our heads. They own the debt. They own the covenants. We don't have $2.4 billion in liquid cash to pay them off. How exactly do you plan to stop them from seizing the IP?" Before Richard could answer, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. The security guard posted outside stumbled backward into the room, looking frantic. "Mr. Sterling, sir, I tried to stop them, but they had a court order and building authorization." "Who the hell is interrupting an executive session?" Richard roared, his patience completely depleted. The security guard stepped aside. A woman walked into the boardroom. She was flanked by 2 imposing men in sharp dark suits who looked less like lawyers and more like private military contractors. She wore a meticulously tailored, midnight blue Alexander McQueen suit that commanded absolute authority. Her hair, once kept in practical, hurried ponytails, was now styled in a sleek, powerful cut. Her posture was flawless. There was no hesitation in her stride, no fear in her eyes. She moved like a predator stepping into a cage of terrified prey. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face so quickly he looked as though he might pass out. Jonathan Davis, sitting to Richard's right, dropped his Mont Blanc pen. It hit the mahogany table with a sharp clack that echoed in the silent room. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Evelyn Cross said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly calm. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at Jonathan. She addressed the room. "Who are you?" Arthur Pendleton demanded, though his tone was wary, sensing the massive shift in the room's gravity. "My name is Evelyn Cross," she said, pulling out a chair at the opposite end of the long table, and sitting down with deliberate, agonizing slowness. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." A collective gasp rippled through the board members. "Evelyn?" Richard finally choked out, grabbing the edge of the table to keep his balance. His mind was fracturing, desperately trying to reconcile the pathetic, broken woman he had thrown into the rain 5 years ago with the apex predator sitting across from him. This is impossible. You don't have this kind of capital." "You're, what, Richard?" Evelyn interrupted, her eyes finally locking onto his. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A step to start. A useful idiot? A discarded asset? She turned her attention back to the bewildered board. 5 years ago, your esteemed CEO pushed me out of this company under the threat of fabricated federal charges. Charges facilitated by your current lead counsel, Mr. Jonathan Davis. Jonathan shrank back in his chair, suddenly looking physically ill. "That's slander," Richard shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Security, get her out of here. She has no right to be in this building." "Actually, Richard, I have every right," Evelyn said, gesturing to one of the men behind her. The man stepped forward and dropped a massive stack of bound legal documents onto the table. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, Apex Holdings officially executed the default clause on the $2.4 billion in corporate debt owed by Sterling Dynamics," Evelyn stated clearly, leaning forward, resting her forearms on the table. "Because the company failed to provide the capital within the 1-hour grace period stipulated in the revised addendum, an addendum your lawyers neglected to read carefully when they refinanced last year, Apex Holdings has officially seized the collateral." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "I own the patents, Richard. I own the algorithm. I own the proprietary software that makes this company function." She smiled, a razor-thin curve of her lips that offered absolutely no warmth. "In short, gentlemen, I own Sterling Dynamics, and Richard Sterling is currently trespassing in my building." "You can't do this," Richard yelled, his face purple with rage and terror. He looked wildly at the board members. "Arthur, don't listen to her. This is illegal. We'll tie her up in litigation for a decade." "Litigate with what money, Richard?" Evelyn asked softly. "I froze the corporate operating accounts 15 minutes ago. You can't even pay the electricity bill for this building, let alone a retainer for a litigation team." She stood up, buttoning the single button of her blazer, projecting absolute, unassailable dominance. "The board has a choice," Evelyn announced. "Option A, you stand by Richard. I liquidate the patents to your biggest competitor, Silvercorp, by midnight tonight. Sterling Dynamics goes bankrupt by Friday, and your shares become expensive toilet paper. Every single one of you loses millions." She let them digest the poison before offering the antidote. Option B. The board votes right here, right now, to terminate Richard Sterling as CEO, effective immediately, without severance, citing gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. You also terminate Jonathan Davis. In return, Apex Holdings will convert the debt into equity. We will inject $500 million in fresh capital to stabilize the stock. You will lose your majority control, but you will keep your wealth, and the company survives. Evelyn looked down the length of the table at her ex-husband, the man who had taken everything from her. He was sweating, shaking, his meticulously crafted image shattered into a million jagged pieces. "The choice is yours, gentlemen," Evelyn said, her voice echoing in the absolute silence. "But I suggest you vote quickly. I have a dinner reservation at 8, and I despise being late." The silence in the boardroom was absolute, save for the frantic, shallow breathing of Richard Sterling. The 12 men sitting around the mahogany table were sharks, billionaires who had built their fortunes on the blood of weaker companies. They had no loyalty to Richard. Their only allegiance was to their portfolios. And Evelyn Cross had just shown them the butcher's bill. Arthur Pendleton, the eldest and most ruthless of the board members, was the first to move. He slowly took off his reading glasses, his eyes entirely devoid of sympathy as they locked onto Richard. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice gravelly and devoid of emotion, "you assured this board repeatedly that the leveraged acquisitions were fully stress-tested against market fluctuations. You lied. You overextended our core assets, and now this firm holds the keys to the kingdom." Arthur turned to Evelyn, offering a sharp, respectful nod. "Ms. Cross, if we comply with your terms and terminate Richard and Jonathan, we have your binding word that the Parsons remain untouched and the $500 million in liquidity is injected by tomorrow morning." "You have my word, Mr. Pendleton," Evelyn replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with Richard. "Apex Holdings does not break its contracts. The funds are already sitting in an escrow account at Chase Manhattan, awaiting the execution of the termination papers." "Arthur, you can't be serious," Richard bellowed, his voice cracking, slapping his hands against the table. "I built this company's public profile. I took us public. You can't just hand the reins to a ghost firm." "You didn't build the foundation, Richard," Arthur retorted coldly. "And right now, the foundation is crumbling. We are voting." It took less than 40 seconds. 11 hands went up in favor of immediate termination. The 12th board member, a man Richard had personally sponsored, looked down at his shoes and slowly raised his hand as well. It was unanimous. "The motion carries," Arthur announced. He looked at Jonathan Davis, who was practically shrinking into his tailored suit. "Jonathan, you are dismissed as lead counsel. Richard, your tenure as CEO is over. You will clear your personal affection in the building immediately." "You backstabbing cowards," Richard hissed, his face flushed with a terrifying mix of rage and humiliation. He turned to Evelyn, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You think you've won, Evelyn? You think you can just walk in here and take my life? I have lawyers. I have friends in the Senate. I would tie you up in antitrust litigation until you are bankrupt." Evelyn finally stood up. She walked slowly around the long table, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She stopped just a few feet away from him. Richard instinctively took a half step back. The woman standing before him bore no resemblance to the weeping, defeated wife he had thrown into the rain. She was an absolute force of nature. "Litigation requires leverage, Richard," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low conversational volume that carried perfectly through the silent room. "And you have none left. I didn't just buy your corporate debt. Over the last 6 months, Apex Holdings quietly acquired the mortgages on your Greenwich estate, your Hamptons property, and the commercial lease for this very building. You are functionally insolvent." She reached into her blazer and produced a small silver flash drive, tossing it onto the table in front of Jonathan Davis. "And as for you, Jonathan," Evelyn continued, her gaze turning to the disgraced attorney, 5 years ago, you helped Richard forge financial documents to free me from embezzlement. You bought off the internal auditors and threatened me with federal prison. It was a very neat, very tidy piece of blackmail. Unfortunately for you, you were snappy. You kept the original undoctored ledgers on a secure server at your law firm." Jonathan's face turned the color of ash. "How could you possibly? I pay better than you do," Evelyn stated simply. A paralegal at your firm, a young woman tired of covering up your illicit billing practices, was more than happy to hand over the unencrypted server logs for a guaranteed position at Apex Holdings. That flash drive contains undeniable proof of extortion, fraud, and conspiracy. The New York State Bar Association will have a copy in an hour. The district attorney will have theirs by 5 o'clock. Jonathan stood up so fast his chair tipped over, crashing to the floor. He didn't say a word. He grabbed his briefcase, his hand shaking violently, and practically sprinted out of the boardroom. Evelyn turned her attention back to her ex-husband. "You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate my building, Richard. If you are still on the premises at 3:15 p.m., I will have the police arrest you for trespassing." Richard looked around the room, desperately seeking a friendly face, a lifeline, anything. But the board members were already packing up their documents, refusing to look at him. He was a ghost. He was already dead in the water, and they were simply stepping over his corpse. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Richard turned and walked out of the boardroom. The walk to the executive elevator was the longest journey of his life. The news had already broken on the internal company network. As he walked past the glass-walled cubicles at open-plan desks, hundreds of employees, people who had feared and revered him just that morning, now stared at him in stunned silence. Some whispered, others openly smirked. The Emperor had no clothes. When he reached the ground floor lobby, two burly security guards, men whose salaries Richard used to pay, stepped into his path. "Mr. Sterling," the head guard said firmly, holding out a cardboard box containing a few framed photos and a humidor from Richard's office. "We've been instructed to escort you off the property. Your corporate key card has been deactivated." Richard snatched the box, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He was marched out through the revolving glass doors, right into a swarm of waiting paparazzi and financial reporters. The news of the hostile takeover and the stock crash had leaked to the press. Flashes blinded him. Microphones were shoved into his face. "Richard, is it true you've been ousted?" "Mr. Sterling, what is your comment on the massive debt default?" "Richard, who is Evelyn Cross?" He pushed his way through the throngs of reporters, ignoring the screaming questions, desperately looking for his waiting town car. It wasn't there. His driver, an employee of Sterling Dynamics, had been ordered back to the garage. With no car, no security detail, and the rain beginning to mist over Manhattan, the former billionaire was forced to hail a yellow cab, clutching his pathetic cardboard box to his chest, fleeing the empire he had stolen. The cab ride to his Upper East Side townhouse cost $42. When Richard swiped his black American Express card to pay the fare, the machine beeped an angry red. Deck-lined, panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness in Richard's chest. He tried a secondary corporate card. Deck-lined. "Buddy, you gonna pay or what?" the cab driver grunted, looking at him through the plexiglass divider. Swallowing his pride, Richard dug into his pockets, scraping together $50 in crumpled cash. He practically threw it into the tray and scrambled out of the cab. He keyed into the massive 4-story townhouse, desperate for a sanctuary, desperate for a drink, and desperate to figure out a plan. The house was strangely quiet. The usual bustle of the housekeeping staff was absent. "Chloe!" Richard called out, dropping the cardboard box on the marble foyer table. "Chloe, are you here?" He found her in the master bedroom on the 3rd floor. The room looked like it had been hit by a tornado. 3 massive Louis Vuitton steamer trunks were open on the floor, and Chloe was frantically throwing designer dresses, cashmere sweaters, and jewelry boxes into them. She wasn't wearing her usual immaculate makeup. She looked frantic, calculating, and incredibly cold. "Chloe, what are you doing?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "Did you see the news? It's a disaster." Evelyn came back. She orchestrated a hostile takeover. They froze the accounts. We need to call my personal wealth manager right now and start moving our liquid assets to the Cayman accounts before she gets injunctions on those too. Chloe stopped packing. She slowly turned around to face him, holding a velvet box containing a $500,000 diamond Riviera necklace. She didn't look at him with the adoring, submissive gaze she had perfected over the last 5 years. She looked at him the same way Arthur Pendleton had, like a bad investment. "I already called the wealth manager, Richard," Chloe said, her voice dripping with venom. 2 hours ago, when Bloomberg first reported the stock crash. Good. Richard breathed a sigh of relief, stepping towards her. "So the money is safe. We have enough to fight this. We have enough to disappear if we have to." Chloe let out a harsh, mocking laugh. It was a sound Richard had never heard her make. It sent a chill down his spine. "You really are an idiot, aren't you?" Chloe sneered, snapping the velvet box shut and dropping it into her purse. "There is no money, Richard. The Cayman's accounts are frozen. The Swiss accounts are locked under federal investigation flags. Your ghost firm friend didn't just take the company. She filed a massive civil suit against your personal estate for fraudulent conveyance during your divorce settlement. The courts have placed a temporary freeze on every single asset bearing your name." Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed onto the edge of the California king bed, putting his head in his hands. No, she couldn't have. She didn't have the legal grounds. "She had all the grounds," Chloe shrieked, throwing a Prada shoe across the room in frustration. "You forged the documents to push her out, you absolute moron. And you left a paper trail. The wealth manager told me the SEC is already drafting warrants for your arrest for defrauding shareholders. You aren't just broke, Richard. You're going to federal prison." Richard looked up at his young, beautiful wife. The woman he had traded Evelyn for. The woman he had showered with millions of dollars in gifts, cars, and vacations. "Chloe, please. We can get through this. I can rebuild. I still have my contacts. We can go to my mother's place in Connecticut and—" "Are you out of your mind?" Chloe spat, zipping up the first trunk with a vicious yank. "I am 29 years old. I am not spending the best years of my life visiting you through a plexiglass window or living in your mother's guest room." "We took vows," Richard yelled, his desperation turning into pathetic anger. "For richer or poorer. Oh, please, Richard, grow up. Oh, please, Richard, grow up." Chloe rolled her eyes, her facade completely gone. "The prenup you forced me to sign gives me virtually nothing if we divorce before the 10-year mark. But it didn't say anything about the gifts. The jewelry, the art, the bearer bonds. I've been quietly siphoning off your desk for the last 3 years. Those are mine, and they are coming with me to Dubai tonight." "You're leaving me?" Richard whispered, the absolute reality of his destruction finally settling in. He was entirely alone. "I'm surviving, Richard," Chloe said coldly. She picked up her heavy purse and signaled for the 2 private movers she had hired, who were standing awkwardly in the hallway, to take the trunks. "You made your bed when you underestimated the woman who built you. Now lie in it." She didn't look back as she walked out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, Richard heard the heavy oak front door slam shut, echoing through the empty, silent townhouse. The silence was deafening. Richard sat on the edge of the bed for hours, watching the sunset paint the Manhattan skyline in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. He thought about Evelyn. He thought about the rain 5 years ago. He thought about the absolute agonizing precision with which she had dismantled his life. She hadn't just taken his company. She had exposed the hollow, pathetic reality of his existence. Downstairs, the heavy metallic thud of a battering ram hit the front door. "FBI, open up. We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Richard Sterling." The voice echoed up the ground staircase. The sound of splintering wood followed. Heavy boots hit the marble foyer. Richard didn't move. He didn't try to run. There was nowhere left to go. The architect had returned, and she had burned his stolen castle to the ground, leaving him sitting alone in the ashes. The splintering of the heavy oak door echoed like a gunshot through the empty, cavernous townhouse. Federal agents poured into the marble foyer, their tactical boots tracking water from the Manhattan storm across the pristine floors. At the center of the chaos, Special Agent Thomas Kincaid led the raid, his badge gleaming under the ambient light of the chandelier. They found Richard Sterling exactly where Chloe had left him, sitting on the edge of the California King bed, staring blankly out the window as the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the street below. "Richard Sterling," Agent Kincaid announced, his voice carrying the immovable weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the extortion of Evelyn Cross. Put your hands behind your back." Richard didn't fight. He didn't scream his innocence or demand to call a senator. The fight had been completely drained from him. As the cold steel of the handcuffs ticked around his wrists, he felt the final, irrevocable shattering of his reality. He was escorted out of his own home, past the gaping stares of his wealthy neighbors, and shoved into the back of an armored SUV. The man who had graced the cover of Forbes magazine just a month prior was now nothing more than a federal inmate in a damp suit. But the night of reckoning was far from over. 30 miles away, at John F. Kennedy International Airport, Chloe Adams was furiously checking her diamond-encrusted Rolex as she stood in the first-class priority line for Emirates Flight 202 to Dubai. She had 3 Louis Vuitton trunks checked and a carry-on bag practically bursting with stolen bearer bonds and high-end jewelry. She was minutes away from escaping the blast radius of her husband's collapse. "Passport, please, Mom," the Customs and Border Protection officer requested. Chloe slid her passport across the counter, offering a tight practice smile. "I'm in a bit of a rush. My flight board's in 10 minutes. The officer swiped the passport. The computer terminal immediately flashed a stark, flashing red warning. The officer looked up, his demeanor instantly shifting from polite customer service to guarded authority. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm going to need you to step out of line and come with me," the officer said, gesturing to 2 armed guards who had suddenly appeared flanking the security lane. "Excuse me, do you know who I am?" Chloe snapped, her voice pitching up in panic. "I am a Platinum Medallion member. I am not stepping out of any line. Ma'am, if you do not come quietly, we will put you in restraints," one of the armed guards warned. They led a hyperventilating Chloe into a stark, windowless interrogation room in the bowels of Terminal 4. Sitting at the metal table was Detective Sarah Jenkins of the NYPD's White-Collar Crime Unit, along with a sharply dressed corporate attorney from Apex Holdings. "Chloe Adams Sterling," Detective Jenkins began, opening a manila folder. 2 hours ago, the legal department of Apex Holdings, the new majority shareholder of Sterling Dynamics, reported a substantial theft from the CEO's private residence. Missing items include $500,000 in bearer bonds and several heavily insured pieces of jewelry, originally purchased with corporate funds. "Those are gifts," Chloe shrieked, clutching her designer purse to her chest. "My husband gave them to me. You can't prove otherwise." The Apex attorney smiled a cold, terrifying imitation of Evelyn Cross's own shark-like grin. "Actually, Mrs. Sterling, we can. The bearer bonds are serialized and their transfer was never legally executed. Furthermore, the prenuptial agreement you signed specifically stipulates that all jewelry purchased with Sterling Dynamics assets remains the property of the corporate entity in the event of insolvency. You are currently attempting to flee the country with stolen corporate assets." Chloe's face drained of color. The carefully constructed facade of the untouchable trophy wife evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, cornered grifter. "You have 2 choices, Chloe. Detective Jenkins stated, leaning across the table. "You hand over the bag, sign a full confession regarding your knowledge of Richard's offshore accounts, and we let you walk out of this airport with the clothes on your back. Or you board a bus to Rikers Island, tonight facing grand larceny charges. Your move." Toei, trembling violently, pushed the heavy purse across the metal table. She walked out to JFK Airport an hour later, stepping into the freezing New York rain with no money, no husband, and no empire. The subsequent federal trial of Richard Sterling became the media spectacle of the decade. The prosecution, led by the ruthless Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Vance Waite, Assistant U.S. Attorney William Harper, dismantled Richard's defense piece by piece. The fatal blow came in the second week of the trial. Jonathan Davis, terrified of the 20-year sentence looming over his own head, accepted a plea deal and turned state's evidence. Taking the witness stand in a crowded Manhattan courtroom, the disgraced lawyer wept as he detailed exactly how he and Richard had forged the ledgers to frame Evelyn. He provided the original, undoctored files, exposing Richard's complete orchestration of the betrayal. Richard sat at the defense table looking older, hollowed out, and entirely defeated. When Judge Arthur Harrison banged his gavel and sentenced Richard Sterling to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole, Richard didn't even blink. He had died the moment Evelyn walked into that boardroom. While Richard's life was dismantled in the courts, Evelyn Cross was busy rebuilding a Titan. She rebranded Sterling Dynamics to Vanguard Corporate Solutions, scrubbing Richard's name from the history books. She liquidated the vanity projects, fired the bloated executive staff that had enabled Richard's ego, and restructured the company's debt with the precision of a master surgeon. Within 18 months, Vanguard's stock didn't just recover, it shattered its previous all-time highs. Evelyn sat in her penthouse office overlooking the New York skyline, the very city that had once threatened to swallow her whole. Harrison Brooks sat across from her, raising a glass of expensive bourbon. "To the architect," Harrison toasted, a rare, genuine smile crossing his weathered face. "You didn't just survive the fire, Evelyn. You bought the match company." Evelyn clinked her glass against his. "Revenge is a poor business model, Harrison. I just corrected a market inefficiency. Richard was a liability. I simply balanced a ledger." Miles away, in the harsh, fluorescent-lit cafeteria of the Allenwood Federal Correctional Complex, inmate 87402, formerly known as Richard Sterling, sat eating a tasteless tray of powdered eggs. He glanced up at the small television bolted to the concrete wall in the corner of the room. CNBC was playing. The camera showed the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. There, standing on the balcony, ringing the opening bell to thunderous applause, was Evelyn. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly untouchable. Richard looked down at his plastic spoon, the sound of the cheering ringing in his ears, forever trapped in the cage of his own making, knowing that the woman he had discarded was the only reason he had ever been a king. True power is never loud. It operates in the shadows, builds quietly, and strikes only when the foundation is entirely secure. Evelyn's journey proves that the ultimate revenge against betrayal isn't anger or bitterness. It is unparalleled, undeniable success. Richard believed he could steal her brilliance and discard her without consequence, but he fundamentally misunderstood who was holding his empire together. Karma delivered a masterful checkmate, leaving Richard with nothing and elevating Evelyn to heights she always deserved. A story is a powerful reminder that those who dig graves for others often end up buried in them themselves. If you loved this epic tale of betrayal, strategy, and ultimate justice, please like this video, share it with anyone who loves a brilliant comeback story, and hit that subscribe button for more thrilling, real-life dramas. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite twist in Evelyn's master plan?